Hi, and welcome back to lecture number 76. I am surprised that you made it back here after that really long lecture on number 75. I promise this one's going to be shorter, though that's not saying much because of how long the last one was. So this is 8.2, the Cold War from 1945 to 1980, and our theme is America in the World. One learning objective, that is, explain the continuities and changes in Cold War policies from 1945 to 1980. So we're going to see some fluctuations in Cold War policy throughout this period, and a lot of it has to do with who is US president and also who is the premier of the Soviet Union. That's going to impact a lot of those changes. So to begin, the United States policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence. These initial goals are going to drive the initial policy of the United States. So we're trying to limit the growth of communism. After World War II, there was Soviet occupation of East Germany and East Berlin, and the Eastern European countries where the Soviet Union still had a military presence. They were allowed to hold their elections, but most of the elections that they held elected Soviet-friendly politicians and leaders. As far as Germany, it was split up into 4 different occupation zones. One zone in the east was held by the Soviet Union. Then in the west, you had one held by France, Great Britain, and the United States. Then the city of Berlin, which lay entirely in East Germany, that was also split up into 4 zones in the same pattern as the rest of Germany. Now, we've talked about George Kennan in the last lecture. He was an American diplomat in Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and he writes back to the United States, to the State Department, via telegram, in a really long message, hence the name Long Telegram, in which he is describing Soviet policy as being aggressive and how the Soviet Union has this contrarian view of the world in which it's them against everyone else, and the United States needs to counter this by matching that aggressiveness or showing that we are not going to give in to that aggression. Harry Truman, who was the president during this time at the end of World War II, agrees with Kennan and puts in place the Truman Doctrine. So this is a policy that's going to support any country that's trying to keep communism out. So famous example is that Greece and Turkey were experiencing some communist movements within their countries, and the United States had sent $400 million of aid to both of those countries to try and stabilize the economic situation there, to bring back some legitimacy and some confidence in the governments of those countries, and keep communism out. And finally, the National Security Act that's passed in 1947 creates the National Security Council. It reshuffles the cabinet in terms of the CIA and the agencies in the United States government that are meant to protect the U.S. So this is where the Department of War turns into the Department of Defense. The CIA is formally established, and it becomes the first peacetime intelligence agency. Before, all of the intelligence agencies, the OSS, they had only been active during war, but now this is going to be an ongoing struggle to try and counter communism. And if the Soviets are going to be spying on the Americans, and the United States need to keep eyes on those people who might possibly be spies, or they might send some spies operations abroad. And the National Security Council, earlier in its creation, issued out the NSC 68. It was about a 50-60 page document that was the blueprint that the United States was going to follow for militarization and buildup of defenses and arms during the Cold War. So this is how we begin the Cold War, by increasing spending in the military-industrial complex, by posturing against the Soviet Union to show that we are not going to back down. All right, other objectives was to create a free market global economy and also build an international security system. So to create a free market global economy, we helped found the World Bank to fund the reconstruction in these countries that have been ravaged by World War II, and the International Monetary Fund, that's the IMF, to oversee the balance of payments and financial crises across the world. This issue of balance of payments was really important because, as you remember, during the interwar years when Germany was supposed to continue paying reparations to France and Britain, and France did not want to have a pause in those payments. It just collapsed the entire financial system of those countries, making the Great Depression even worse in Europe. Another benefit to creating stability in the world economy is that the countries that are experiencing high levels of poverty are not going to turn to communism to solve their economic problems. And for building international security, the United States joins NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance for collective security, meaning that if one of the NATO countries is attacked, then the other NATO countries will come to their defense. It's mostly Western European countries and the United States, and countries joined through 1945 to the early 1950s, and the Soviet Union counters NATO with its own military alliance in the Warsaw Pact. So Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, or the Eastern Bloc, you see them on the map on the bottom right. All of the blue countries are NATO, all of the red are Warsaw Pact. And you see that there's a black dividing line between those two countries that runs through most of Germany, and also runs through the Soviet Union and its northern boundary against Finland. And that's what we call the Iron Curtain. This was a term coined by Churchill when he was giving a speech talking about how things are different behind the Iron Curtain and how democracy and freedom are not widespread behind the Iron Curtain. And that's why the Western countries needed to be as strong as they could to counter this communist aggression. All right. As post-war tensions dissolved, the wartime alliance between Western democracies and the Soviet Union, the United States developed a foreign policy based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. Notice how this learning objective is essentially the same as the last one that we just went into. So the only thing that we're really adding here for collective security is the pursuit of the H-bomb. So this is the hydrogen bomb that was about 100 times more powerful than the blast that went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A picture of it is on the bottom left. Again, posturing to the Soviet Union, showing them that we are not going to back down. As far as international aid, we instituted the Marshall Plan, sending money, food, and things needed to European countries recovering from the war in order for them to stave off communism in those countries. Now, in 1948, the borders across Eastern and Western Germany are blockaded by the Soviet Union, and the city of Berlin is inaccessible to the Western Allied powers. Now, the Soviet Union did this as a response to the introduction of the Deutschmark in 1948. So the Soviet Union did not want Germany to have all one currency. They were hoping that maybe it would be a currency that would be more similar or more closely tied to the Soviet ruble. And in an attempt to destabilize the economy of Germany in order to keep Germany weak and keep them from becoming a threat, they close off the borders to the city of Berlin. Now remember that the city of Berlin also had American, British, and French territory or occupation zones. So all those people in West Berlin were left without supplies, left without access to food, and the only way that we could get them food and supplies was through an airlift. So we sent constant airplane loads of food, milk, you can see in the picture there, and supplies needed to survive until finally the Soviets lift the blockade in 1949. Again, showing that the United States is not going to give in to Soviet aggression. And we've talked about the IMF and the World Bank in the previous slides. So Containment is going to be this early period of the Cold War with the United States. So concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements in Korea. So this policy of containment was to try and stop the spread of communism without starting a war, or a full-on war that the United States would have to send soldiers to fight. There were wars that were being fought to try and contain communism, but more often than not, the United States was just sending supplies and money. The main example for this is in communist China. They were fighting a civil war from the end of World War II, 1945, to the end in the communist victory in 1949. Mao Zedong was leading the communist forces, and Chiang Kai-shek was leading the National Democratic Forces. We were sending money and supplies to Chiang Kai-shek and his troops, but eventually the communists push him out of mainland China, and he ends up setting up a government in the island of Taiwan. The fear is that if one country falls to communism, then the other countries around it will also fall to communism. This is the domino theory, and this is why containment was so important for the United States. If they can hold up this one domino, then all of the other ones will also stay up. Now, the key concept outline is pointing out Korea specifically by name, so we need to talk about the Korean War. North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, attacks South Korea, sends the South Korean troops all the way down to the southern coast, almost takes full control of the peninsula. And the United States gets the United Nations to approve a military force to go into South Korea and push the North Korean troops back. Douglas MacArthur, from the island hopping campaign of World War II, and also from the bonus army dispersion during the Great Depression, is sent into South Korea, leading these United Nations forces to repel the North Korean advance. But because he is Douglas MacArthur, he goes overboard and he pushes the North Korean troops all the way up to the Chinese border. Well, China, now a communist country, feels threatened, and so they step in and help the North Koreans, and they push the UN forces back close to the original border between North and South Korea at the 38th parallel. And now this current border is now known as the demilitarized zone, because at the end of the Korean War, when the armistice was agreed to, both sides said that there's going to be a stretch of land along this boundary where there's not going to be any military equipment or defenses that either side can put in there. It is still the most closely watched border in the world, and North Korean defectors sometimes are able to get through the border. No one's really trying to get into North Korea through that border, but it's still quite dangerous. There's landmines in case, and troops on both sides monitoring anyone trying to escape, or even worse, launch an attack across the border. All right, so the Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence, or détente. So we started with this containment policy, and now we are turning up the heat in the Cold War. It's starting to get a lot hotter, and there are more often moments in which the United States and the Soviet Union really look like they're going to launch a war against each other. And part of this starts with the presidency of JFK. As soon as JFK is elected to the White House, the CIA comes up to him and says, hey, we have this operation called the Bay of Pigs operation, named after the landing spot of where these Cuban defectors had plans to launch an attack on the communist regime of Fidel Castro. JFK signs off on it, and it turns out to be a huge disaster, and it fails completely. In 1961, the Soviet Union erects the Berlin Wall to stop movement out of the Eastern Bloc. As you can see the picture in the top right, they sent troops. They are making sure that no one can cross into West Berlin as the wall is being constructed. And then that wall will stand for 28 more years, and it will be heavily guarded. Then in 1962, President Kennedy has greater tensions again in Cuba because it turns out that a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba has spotted some things in Cuba that look like nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles. And it looks like they're building a launch site in Cuba. And so President Kennedy says that the Soviets and Cuba have to stop construction of this military base. They have to return any sort of missiles or nuclear warheads that may already be on the island. They issue a blockade on Cuba, trying to stop any more Soviet shipments coming into the island. And the Cuban base was already pretty far along in construction, and both sides basically had their finger on the button to launch a nuclear attack on each other. And at the very last moment, at the 11th hour, both sides backed off. So Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at this point, agrees to a deal with President Kennedy that he will remove the missiles and the base from Cuba if the United States would secretly later on remove some of their missiles in the country of Turkey. And because both sides saw that they were so close to nuclear war and mutually assured destruction, they say if this ever happens again, if tensions get really high, we should establish a system where we can directly communicate with each other, a direct line from one president to the Soviet premier. And this is what leads us to détente. So we begin to see an easing of tensions. Really starting with the JFK presidency after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then followed by Johnson after JFK is assassinated. The Soviet Union and the United States signed a nuclear test ban treaty, meaning that both countries cannot test nuclear weapons above ground in the atmosphere. And they also signed a non-proliferation treaty that says that they're not going to share nuclear secrets and give other countries the ability to create nuclear weapons, because it's already hard enough to manage two countries that have nuclear weapons. Nixon is elected in 1968. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, has a more pragmatic approach. He is credited with a lot of the foreign policy of the Nixon presidency. He helps end the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. He opens up relations to Communist China, recognizes Communist China as the legitimate government of China, in order to get the Soviet Union to the negotiation table on other issues like the SALT I treaties. This is the limiting the anti-ballistic missiles and freezing the production of ballistic missiles by both countries. You can see that the Vice President Ford, who succeeded President Nixon after he resigned, ends up signing the SALT I agreement with Leonid Brezhnev, who was the Soviet premier at the time. All right, and that was it. Here is our recap. The United States was trying to limit the influence of communism around the world in the Cold War. After World War II, it created economic institutions and provided international aid. So that's the Marshall Plan, the IMF, the World Bank. The containment policy prompted U.S. action in several countries across the world, Korea and Vietnam. And at certain moments, the Cold War nearly became a hot war. So we saw that in the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a period of détente eased tensions between the USSR and the United States through 1980. And the Cold War will end, question mark, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. So that's when the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. All of the countries that made up the Soviet Union become their own independent country. But some critics say that we are still in a Cold War with Russia, given all of their shenanigans in the past 10 years with Vladimir Putin. So we will get to all of that when we get to period 9. But again, thank you for sticking through this lecture. I hope it was helpful. And if you want the lectures to be longer or shorter, please tell me in the comments. Like and subscribe.